Hello and welcome to this video on government failure. In this video we're going to be looking at what government failure means, and then we're going to look at some different types and reasons why government failure happens. So let's start off by setting the scene. I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Now we've looked in previous videos that the government will often intervene in markets to try and correct market failure. Governments might do so through taxes, subsidies, regulations, providing the service themselves, or introducing laws. But sometimes this government intervention actually doesn't succeed, or perhaps makes things worse. And in those circumstances, we would say that the government has failed at correcting the market failure. So what do we mean by government failure? Government failure exists when the government intervenes to correct a market failure, but this results in a more inefficient allocation of resources, or perhaps even a new market failure. So in this situation, we would say the government's intervened and they've failed. This is an important definition. Let's make sure we've got this one down. Okay, so government failure, as we've just said, occurs when an intervention in the market doesn't really work. It leads to a worsening of the existing market failure, or perhaps it creates a new market failure. So the policies, the taxes or the subsidies or the regulations may have damaging long-term consequences for society. Maybe the policy the government had introduced is ineffective in meeting its aim. Maybe the policy has created more losers than winners. In any circumstance here, we would say there has been government failure. So what might be the causes of government failure? Well, there are four that we're going to look at. The first is unintended consequences. Second is excessive administration costs. The third is information gaps, and the fourth is the distortion of price signals. Let's start off with the first one, unintended consequences. So sometimes governments introduce policies and the effects of those policies are unanticipated or unintended. The government didn't foresee that this is what would happen. So well-intentioned laws sometimes act against the interests of those that those laws were intended to help or to serve. And this is because people rarely behave or respond in a predictable way. As we know from our studying of behavioral economics, it's not always clear that people will be very rational in their response to a certain policy. And if we're not sure how they'll respond, it's hard to anticipate the consequences of our actions. A famous example is when the government introduced a smoking ban. So they said you're not allowed to smoke in pubs and restaurants and public areas. Now, this sounds like a good policy designed to correct the market failure of negative externalities of passive smoking. But actually they didn't really anticipate fully how people would react to this. There was an unintended consequence. And the consequence was, if you can't smoke inside a pub, where are you going to go to smoke? Well, you're going to go outside. And you're probably going to go outside in the winter and cluster around one of these. And so as a result of this introduction of a ban on smoking indoors to correct the negative externality of passive smoking, there was a huge increase in demand for patio heaters outside. And if you look closely at a patio heater, at the top, it's basically burning gas to provide warmth and heat. Now, these emissions go into the atmosphere and they contribute to global warming. So by trying to correct the negative externality of passive smoking, the government here have unintendedly worsened the negative externality of global warming. Another example might be in the healthcare sector. So in order to improve healthcare provision, the government have set targets. We want this many people treated, we want this many people out of hospital within 48 hours, and so on. Now that is intended to improve service and help provide healthcare in a more effective manner, which has positive externalities, but they didn't necessarily think about how people or hospitals might react. What might actually happen, or has been shown to happen in a few cases, is that hospitals would prioritize those operations and those treatments that they knew would look good in the numbers, maybe the ones that are easy to cure, and they would try and avoid those trickier operations or those patients where there was less certainty as to the outcome. Is this desirable? well, I think we'd probably conclude that no, we don't want people being treated just because they look good in terms of a statistic. Some other examples of unintended consequences. Often governments introduce higher taxes in order to provide public goods. But actually higher taxes can eat into profits. They can limit businesses' ability to expand and employ people. Also, those businesses that provide merit goods, goods with positive externalities, it reduces the incentive to provide those. So higher taxes can often be seen as a form of government failure. Another example would be bailing out the banks. So back during the financial crisis, the government provided money to keep banks from going bust, to prevent them going insolvent and running out of money. Now, what's the outcome of this? Well, actually, if you run a bank and you know that if you behave recklessly, the government's going to step in and save you, does this not create an incentive to actually not care whether you act recklessly at all, and in future there's no improvement in your behavior? You can be reckless knowing the government are going to help you. So actually this defeats the purpose. Final example might be tariffs on steel. Government might introduce a tax on imported steel to try and help domestic steel producers, but actually all they do is increase prices for customers. Now let's move on to our second cause of government failure, or reason for government failure, and that is value for money, or bureaucracy. So we said that often the government will provide a public sector or a public good to overcome the free rider problem. But what is the social benefit of providing that public sector good or public good? And how do we know that what they're doing here is value for money? How do we know that what they're spending on this actually is the same or less than the social benefit that's being created? So can public goods be provided efficiently by the government? For example, we said that the army is a public good and needs to be provided by the government. But what is the right size of the army? Could it be done at lower cost? What is the opportunity cost? So we might question actually the government intervention here and say, is it value for money? Or actually sometimes that many people will argue that it's likely to be inefficient and not value for money because there's no competition. There's only one provider of the army, only one provider of street lighting, only one provider of flood defences. And so because there's no competition, there's no incentive to do things at the lowest cost. In fact, there's no incentive to have reduced staff costs. So maybe we have too many staff, or maybe there's low productivity in this particular business. Governments will often pass regulations as well, and complying with these regulations often create a lot of extra costs for businesses. And this is sometimes called bureaucracy, the idea that governments pile up lots and lots of regulations, and in order to comply with regulations, you have to change your business, and change involves cost. Okay, the third one is information gaps. So just like the buyers and sellers of cars, governments don't always possess all the relevant information when making decisions. So as a result, they may make suboptimal decisions when deciding on the intervention they're introducing. So they may introduce a tax that's too high for the negative externality that they're trying to address. Or they may subsidize a product that they think has positive externalities, but maybe it doesn't. A good example was a few years ago, there was an outbreak of swine flu, and the UK government were very concerned about this. So to make sure the government could keep functioning, society could keep working, they made an order for 120 million vaccines. And they made that from a order from a manufacturer, GlaxoSmithKline. Now, when they saw that the outbreak wasn't really taking off, they reduced that order to 44 million. But actually, swine flu never really materialized, and only 6 million of the 44 million they bought were ever used. So ultimately, once they'd given 4 million to the World Health Organization for use in Africa, they were left with 34 million flu vaccinations on their shelves. Now, was this a good use of taxpayers' money? Clearly not. Clearly an example of government failure. Why did it occur? Because they didn't really know to the full extent what the outbreak of swine flu was likely to be. Okay, the final one we're going to look at is distortion of price signals. So many economists entered into debates about the value of the free market versus state or government intervention markets. A lot of free market economists really believe that free markets can be very powerful and effective. They drive innovation. The free market is a great way to find solutions to problems through the profit incentive. Prices and the operation of the invisible hand can coordinate large-scale production processes. As we've seen earlier, the price mechanism and the free market serve to ration resources, they signal how resources should be used, and they also allocate resources. And when this process is distorted, when the free market is inhibited through things like taxes or subsidies or maximum prices or minimum prices, the power of the free market to provide these solutions and innovation and coordination, the power to do that is reduced. And so some economists argue that any government intervention will lead to government failure because it will distort the free market. And in fact, governments should really not be trying to intervene actively at all. They should just be focused on making sure that free markets can freely operate. Quite a common example economists use to illustrate government failure might be the national minimum wage. So this has been introduced in the UK for a number of years now and has recently been introduced in other European countries. In fact, many countries around the world have minimum wages, although these tend to differ quite dramatically from country to country, as you can see here. Now, there are lots of arguments for and against a minimum wage, but the arguments against minimum wage will be relevant here in that the intervention by the government in the labour market by providing a minimum wage would lead to negative effects. And so the negative effects here on the right-hand side, the arguments against the minimum wage, would serve to highlight that this is an example of government failure. So I'd like you to pause the video, look particularly at the negative arguments about minimum wage, and make some notes on these in your notes. Once you've done that, you can move on. So in this video, we've looked at what is meant by government failure, and then we've gone on to look at some different reasons and types of government failure. That's it. Thanks for listening.